The late lunch rush had just passed at La Belle Rue, a small but ambitious French bistro tucked between a boutique wine shop and an art gallery downtown. The air smelled of butter, garlic, and the faint sweetness of freshly baked tarts cooling near the kitchen. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, catching on the polished cutlery and glinting off wine glasses arranged with military precision. Daniel, the head waiter, smoothed his crisp black vest and adjusted the cuffs of his white shirt. He prided himself on keeping the dining room as immaculate as his uniform. Nothing out of place, nothing beneath the restaurant's cultivated elegance. To him, appearances mattered. The front door opened with the soft jingle of the brass bell. Daniel glanced up from the espresso machine and immediately noticed the newcomer. She was a woman in her late 30s, wearing a loose gray hoodie over faded jeans, sneakers that had clearly seen better days, and her hair pulled back into a simple ponytail. She carried a small notebook tucked under one arm. Daniel's first thought was that she looked like someone stopping in for directions, not a customer at an upscale bistro. He straightened, putting on the professional smile he reserved for situations where he wasn't sure he actually wanted to seat someone. The woman looked around briefly, then approached the host stand where Daniel stood. "Hi," she said warmly. "Do you have a table for one?" Daniel hesitated just long enough for it to be noticeable. "We do," he replied slowly, "though we usually recommend reservations for our lunch service." The woman's smile didn't falter. "That's fine. I'm happy to wait if you're busy." Daniel looked around the half-empty dining room. Plenty of tables sat ready. But instead of leading her to one near the window, he reached for a small menu and motioned toward a table near the kitchen door, far from the prime seating. "This one should work for you," he said. She glanced toward the noisier spot and then back at him, one eyebrow raised. "I don't mind waiting for a nicer table if that's all right." Daniel gave a small, polite laugh. "We like to keep those for guests, dressed for the occasion." His tone was measured, but the implication hung in the air like a low cloud. The woman paused for a beat, her eyes meeting his in a way that made him slightly uncomfortable. But then she simply nodded and followed him to the offered table. As she sat, she pulled her notebook from under her arm, flipped it open, and began jotting something down without looking at the menu. Daniel assumed she was just making notes to herself. He didn't realize yet that every word would matter, to her, to him, and to the future of La Belle Rue. Daniel returned to the woman's table with a wine list, his posture straight, his expression perfectly neutral. The seat he had chosen for her, near the clatter of dishes and the faint draft from the kitchen door, was hardly what the restaurant's PR manager would call Instagram-worthy. But in Daniel's mind, it fit. She glanced up as he approached. "Thanks," she said simply, closing her notebook. Her voice was calm, without a hint of irritation, but her eyes, sharp and observant, lingered on him a second longer than most guests would. "Would you care to start with a glass of wine?" Daniel asked, his tone polite but not particularly warm. "We have a lovely Sauvignon Blanc by the glass, crisp, light, refreshing. Might be a nice way to elevate the experience." The pause before elevate wasn't long, but it carried a certain weight, as if the experience in question needed rescuing from her current state. She smiled faintly. "I think I'll just have sparkling water for now." Daniel inclined his head, jotting it down. "Of course." When he brought the water, he placed it carefully on the table, but with the kind of efficiency that suggested he didn't expect her to linger. "Are you ready to order?" "I'd like to hear your specials," she said. He rattled them off quickly. Roasted duck with cherry glaze, lobster bisque, and a seasonal mushroom risotto. As he spoke, he noted her sneakers again, the faint wear along the seams. His mind made silent calculations about whether she'd choose the risotto, the cheapest of the three, or something pricier. "I'll have the duck, please," she said without hesitation. That caught him off guard, though he didn't show it. "Very well," he replied, closing his notepad. As he moved through the dining room to place the order, Daniel caught snippets of the woman scribbling in her notebook again. It wasn't unusual for diners to jot down shopping lists or reminders, but something about the way she wrote, quickly, deliberately, with short glances at her surroundings, made him curious. The meal arrived 20 minutes later, and Daniel set the plate down with a flourish. "Our chef recommends savoring the sauce with each bite," he offered, a line he rarely delivered to guests he didn't think would care. She looked at him with that same unreadable expression. I'm sure it's wonderful, she said before taking out her phone. Not to text, but to photograph the dish from several angles. Daniel raised an eyebrow. Capturing it for Instagram? Something like that, she replied, her tone light. As he walked away, Daniel dismissed the thought. But somewhere in the back of his mind, a quiet unease began to form. A sense that perhaps this lunch wasn't going to be as routine as he thought. The scent of seared duck and cherry glaze lingered in the air as the woman took her first bite. She closed her eyes for a brief moment, not in exaggerated performance, but in genuine contemplation. Then she picked up her pen and began writing again, her hand moving steadily over the page. From the other side of the dining room, Daniel watched as he refilled another table's water glasses. He couldn't help but notice how methodical she was. Bite. Right. Sip of water. Right again. She wasn't scrolling through her phone. She wasn't chatting idly with friends. Her focus was on the food, the space, and occasionally on him. When he returned to check in, she looked up from her notebook. The duck is very good, she said, though the sauce could use just a touch more acidity to balance the richness. Daniel gave a polite nod, masking his surprise. I'll be sure to pass that along to the chef. His voice carried no sarcasm, but internally he bristled. Most diners didn't dissect flavors so confidently, and certainly not ones he had mentally filed under casual drop-ins. She tapped her pen against the edge of her notebook. Tell me, do you source your produce locally? The question caught him off guard. Some of it, he replied. We have suppliers who bring in seasonal ingredients. Her pen moved again. A couple at a nearby table shot curious glances in her direction, noticing the notebook too. Daniel felt a faint prickle of unease, the kind that comes when something doesn't fit neatly into expectation. Would you like dessert? He asked after clearing her plate. Yes, please, she said. What's your signature? The chocolate souffle, he replied automatically. It takes about 15 minutes to prepare. I'll wait, she said without hesitation, jotting something else down. Daniel headed toward the kitchen, but halfway there he slowed. A thought flickered at the edge of his mind, about the careful way she was evaluating every step of her meal. The questions, the photographs, the meticulous notes. This wasn't casual dining behavior. It was something else. By the time the souffle went into the oven, the prickle in the back of his mind had grown sharper. He didn't know it yet, but every interaction, every word he'd chosen, and every subtle dig he'd delivered earlier in the meal was being recorded, not just on paper, but for an audience far larger than the cafe's four walls. The chocolate souffle emerged from the kitchen with its delicate crown rising perfectly above the ramekin, a dusting of powdered sugar catching the afternoon light. Daniel carried it to the woman's table with the kind of precise care that came from years of balancing delicate plates between curious glances from other diners. She looked genuinely pleased as he set it down. It's beautiful, she said, taking out her phone again. This time, she leaned slightly to capture not just the dessert, but the table setting, the light, and even the reflection in the polished wine glass. Do you take a lot of food photos? Daniel asked, forcing a casual tone. Only when it's worth remembering, she replied, her smile quick, but her eyes still studying him in that deliberate way that made him feel both seen and assessed. Daniel lingered by the table a moment longer than necessary, unsure why. How's your experience been so far? He asked, half expecting, and maybe half dreading, an answer that would challenge him. She set her spoon down after the first bite of souffle, making another note before speaking. The food has been well prepared. The atmosphere's warm. The service, she paused deliberately, meeting his gaze, has been interesting. There was no malice in her tone, but the choice of words was like a pebble dropped in a still pond. It sent ripples through Daniel's composure. I see, he said, unsure whether to press further. Interesting how? She only smiled faintly, tapping her pen against the open notebook. I'll let you know when I'm done. The cafe had grown quieter now, the late lunch crowd gone and the early dinner service not yet started. With fewer distractions, Daniel found himself more aware of the ticking clock on the wall and the way she seemed perfectly at ease, unhurried. As she took her final bite, she asked, How long have you worked here? 3 years, Daniel replied automatically. I started as a server and worked my way up. Her pen moved again. So, you're invested in this place? Yes, he said with more pride than he expected. I am. She looked at him for a moment, her expression unreadable, and then closed her notebook. That's good to know. Daniel collected the empty ramekin, but her last comment lingered in his mind as he walked back toward the kitchen. There was something about the way she said it, like it was a fact that would matter later. He still didn't know that later was only minutes away. The souffle dish was barely cleared when Daniel returned to the table with the leather-bound check presenter. Whenever you're ready, he said with a polite nod, placing it neatly beside her notebook. The woman didn't immediately reach for it. Instead, she leaned back slightly, her fingertips resting on the closed cover of her notes. I'll settle up in a moment, she said casually. But before that, I'd like to ask you a few more questions. Daniel hesitated. Questions? Yes, she said as if it were the most natural thing in the world. How would you describe La Belle Rue in 3 words? It was an odd request for a diner to make at the end of a meal, but Daniel humored her. Elegant, authentic, refined, he said without missing a beat. Her pen came out again. She wrote it down verbatim. And how do you think the restaurant wants its guests to feel when they dine here? She asked. Daniel glanced around the softly lit room, the linen-covered tables, the faint strains of French jazz playing overhead. Special, he said after a moment. Like they're part of something elevated. Another note, another quiet nod. Then she looked up at him directly. Would you say that applies to every guest? No matter how they're dressed? The question caught him off guard. Well, yes, ideally, he said slowly. But first impressions do play a part in how we engage with people. She didn't write that down. She just looked at him for a long moment before saying, Interesting. Something in her tone made the hair on the back of his neck prickle. This wasn't idle curiosity. There was an underlying structure to her questions, like she was working through a checklist. Daniel tried to deflect with a half smile. You ask questions like you're a critic or something. She smiled, not broadly, but with a knowing warmth. Or something. Before he could probe further, she slipped the bill into the presenter along with her credit card. He took it, still turning over her words in his mind as he walked to the register. While running the payment, he glanced toward her table. She was now speaking quietly into her phone, angled slightly toward the window for better light. From his position, he couldn't hear her, but he saw the way she gestured lightly with her free hand, the way people do when they're describing a scene to someone else. And then, almost unconsciously, she opened her notebook again and began reading over the pages she'd filled. By the time Daniel returned with her receipt, the uneasy hum in his thoughts had become harder to ignore. Whatever was happening here, it wasn't just a casual lunch, and he was starting to suspect that he was about to find out exactly why. Daniel set the signed receipt down on the table, ready to deliver the usual parting phrase, "Thank you for dining with us," when the woman spoke before he could. Daniel, she began, her tone calm but deliberate, I think you should know why I came here today. Something in the way she said it made his chest tighten slightly. All right, he said cautiously. She folded her hands on top of her closed notebook. I'm not just a customer. I'm Marissa Cole, host of Behind the Plate, a national food and service review program. For a second, the words didn't quite register. He knew the show. Millions of viewers each week. Unfiltered critiques of restaurants, ranging from hidden gems to the country's most prestigious dining rooms. A single positive feature could fill reservation books for months. A negative one could damage a reputation overnight. Daniel's mouth went dry. You're reviewing La Belle Rue? Yes, Marissa said, holding his gaze steadily. We visit unannounced, dressed in ways that don't signal our role. We want to see how staff treat every guest, not just the ones they think matter. A flash of heat crept up Daniel's neck. He remembered their first interaction, the hesitation before seating her, the choice of the noisy table near the kitchen, the remark about dressing for the occasion. Each moment replayed with uncomfortable clarity. She continued, her voice level but firm. I noticed the shift in your tone after you saw me taking notes and asking questions. But first impressions matter. A guest's experience begins the second they walk through that door, and nothing about their appearance should dictate their treatment. Daniel shifted his weight. unsure whether to apologize immediately or try to explain. I, Marissa raised a hand, not unkindly, but enough to keep him from speaking over her. You weren't rude exactly, but you were dismissive. And that's the kind of service that makes guests feel unwelcome, whether they have a camera crew waiting outside or they're just here for lunch. He nodded slowly, feeling the sting of each observation. I understand. Marissa's expression softened slightly. You know the food here is excellent. The chef's work speaks for itself. But service is the soul of a restaurant. I need to see if the two align. The quiet of the dining room pressed in around them. Daniel could almost hear the faint click of the pen in her hand as she slid it back into her bag. I'll be meeting with the owner later today to share my experience, she said finally. And yes, some of it will be on the show. It was like a gavel hitting the table, a finality in her tone that left no doubt. For the first time in years, Daniel felt truly nervous about a guest's departure. Marissa rose from the table, tucking her notebook neatly into a leather satchel. Daniel noticed that she moved with the quiet confidence of someone used to being watched, yet entirely unaffected by the weight of that attention. As she headed toward the door, Daniel instinctively followed a few steps behind. Ms. Cole, he said softly, enough so it didn't carry across the dining room. I know I didn't handle things the right way at first. I'd like the chance to make it right, for you and for the restaurant. She paused, one hand on the doorframe, and turned to face him. Her gaze wasn't unkind, but it was firm. Daniel, making it right isn't about me. It's about the next person who walks in wearing sneakers or a hoodie or anything that doesn't match your mental picture of the ideal guest. He nodded slowly, feeling the truth in her words. You can't fix this lunch, she continued, but you can decide what kind of service you give from now on. And trust me, people notice. Whether they're a critic with a camera crew or a regular with no platform at all, their experience shapes the reputation of this place. With that, she gave him a brief but genuine smile and stepped out into the bright afternoon sunlight. The door closed softly behind her, leaving the faint jingle of the bell hanging in the air. Minutes later, the quiet didn't last. The kitchen door swung open and Jean-Paul, the owner and head chef, emerged in his flour-dusted apron, holding a folded slip of paper. Daniel, he said, his French accent thickening when he was stressed. I just got a text from a friend. Marissa Cole was here? Is that true? Daniel exhaled slowly. Yes, she told me before she left. Jean-Paul's eyes widened. And how was her experience? Daniel hesitated. Mixed. The chef rubbed his temples. Mixed is bad. Mixed can be worse than bad, because it means the food was good, but something else failed. I know, Daniel admitted quietly. That something else was me. Jean-Paul stared at him for a long moment, then sighed. I have worked 20 years for a Michelin star. If we get bad press, months of work can disappear. But if you learn from this, maybe there is hope. A second chance. That evening, as the dinner crowd began to fill the tables, Daniel found himself watching the door with a different mindset. A young man in a worn denim jacket walked in, looking slightly uncertain. This time, Daniel didn't hesitate. He greeted the man warmly, guided him to the best available table by the window, and offered him the same polished menu presentation he reserved for the wealthiest diners. It wasn't about pretending everyone was a critic. It was about realizing everyone deserved the treatment of one. As the night went on, Daniel knew he couldn't control what Marissa's episode would say, but he could control what guests experienced from that moment forward, and maybe, just maybe, when the show aired, there would still be something worth salvaging.